welcome Julia Korkman to our podcast.
Thank you so much.
I'm so honored to have you here, Julia. I have to say to our listeners who don't know you that at least in the Nordic region, you are quite a famous psychologist within this area. So it's a big honor having you here. And I'm so impressed with what you are doing, not only in Finland, but across Europe.
Thank you.
Thank you. Julia, this season of Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, the focus is on implementation of investigative interviewing and the need for this and what it really is and why it's important seen from different perspectives and contexts. So may I ask you, this is the standard question in the beginning of this season, is that what do you think is the ethos of investigative interviewing?
There would be so many different points of departure to answer that question.
Okay.
But I think the first and foremost answer would perhaps be that what we know very well that if investigative interviews are done the wrong way, they can lead to quite terrible miscarriages of justice for all involved parties. So my own sort of trajectory within legal psychology started with observing the way in which children were interviewed in Finland some 20 plus years ago in the investigation of particularly sexual abuse cases, which was really, really poor. And I'm glad to say it's a bit better today, but it's still a difficult area, of course. But there it's quite obvious if you interview young children in a way that is not recommendable, then you will inevitably end up with problematic and accounts that include mistakes and can actually lead to completely wrongful conclusions. And of course, we know from the large number of cases that have been investigated in the Nordics, in Europe, and globally with wrongful convictions, we know that investigative interviewing really has a core part to play in leading to these kinds of miscarriages of justice. And for me personally, one of my sort of favorite areas to think about and do research in is memory, human memory, which I think is something we share, both you and I and many others who are involved in these issues. And I can't get over how surprising it is that although the legal system was built by human beings for human beings, and the basic material we look at when we are assessing, especially I would say, crimes against human beings, it's memory. And still, these processes really have far too little recognition of how humans work. So it's not really based on how human beings work. And in my country, as in many, many other countries around the world, police officers and justice professionals are not obliged to have any training in how memory works, which is crazy because it's really what they work with when they are investigating crimes, when they are trying to get these memories out of people, when they're trying to assess if they're credible or reliable or not. It's all about understanding how memory works, or much of it is. Of course, there are other things at play. There's communication and there's a lot of psychological features, etc. But this is one of the things that continues to surprise me and bother me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I see my work lately has been mostly on decision making, and there is exactly the same about how they just assume that if they get information, they will automatically reach the right conclusion. And it's really interesting to see how little, although when you go into the theory, I have to say also when you try to dissect at least some verdicts in Supreme Courts and stuff, I think there is a lot of good traditions when it comes to decision making, but that decision making doesn't seem to be explicit.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, for example, when looking at how the judicial decision-making is conducted in many countries, including my own, judges are required to sort of describe how they came to a certain conclusion. And I'm training judges quite a bit here in Finland and also in Sweden to some extent. And I've heard many times judges comment on the fact that this kind of writing down and describing why you came to a certain conclusion. It's an efficient measure to stop the worst kinds of quick and bad decision-making performances. So already having to take a step back and then really write down why you make the decision you make, it sort of prevents you from making some assumptions that you are blind for yourself. So I heard this one judge some time ago saying that that he he's been in the situation where he's like pretty sure during the whole process, during all the hearings, how this case will sort of turn out, what the verdict will be. And then in the end, when he's writing that decision, he's like, this doesn't add up. I can't write that he's guilty. I can't remember what decision he was referring to at the point, but anyway, can't write that he's guilty just because my gut feeling is that he's probably done it. Like the evidence just doesn't add up. And I think this is what we know, of course, from research, that if you actually take your time to logically assess the evidence, then that is preventing you from falling into these traps. But I think all of us, of course, are can be sort of victims of bad decision making. It's very inherently part of being a human being. So this kind of slower decision making and analytical assessment of the evidence is, of course, something we would like to have more of in the police as well. This is one of the struggles I think we are facing in at least my country, in the police organization, is that there is no explicit requirement to actually do these kind of hypothesis testing in an explicit way and actually write down the assessment. So that's something that would be really great to have. But I agree with you and especially I think some of the Supreme Court decisions, especially during the last 10 years, have been really, really good. And some of them show an impressive understanding of how human beings work. So it's not like all over the place. And I think it is improving quite a bit. So, yeah. So I'm still quite optimistic about the future here.
I remember many years ago when I was just starting to do this training in Norway. It must be at least 25 years ago, Julia. I invited an appeal court judge, a senior appeal court judge from Oslo, to come and talk to my students and myself, indeed, about how they perceived our work when it comes to interviewing and all that, and how we could improve from a judge's perspective. And that was quite rare at that time. The judges didn't really want to talk to police. They wanted to have this distance. And I understand that, but still, there must be a stage where we can communicate. So I remember he said, oh, there is a lot of good things going on in the police. It's not too bad, but why don't you kind of try to help the witnesses to say the same thing when they come to court? Because after all, you have been talking to all of them. So why should I sit there as a judge and listen to all these different stories? That was so funny.
Oh, okay. So you should just train them to have the same story so he doesn't need to bother about it.
Because you guys, know what happened, don't you?
Oh, that's interesting. Actually, that's something actually some police officers have said also, is that they've come to realize that if you, as a police officer, are heard in court, you're given quite a lot of credibility. And many of them have noted that that's utterly, it's of course completely based on nothing. It's not like if you're a police officer, you have better eyesight than other people or better perception, or so that's an interesting observation, I think. And the same thing seems to go for medical doctors. If you're a medical doctor, you're likely to be very, very highly regarded. And I'm not saying medical doctors should not be highly regarded, but of course they should be scrutinized the same way as other expert witnesses, that you have to see what they are actually basing their assessments on.
Exactly. And as you say, I think there is definitely a lot, like my PhD, where I found out I was expecting, when I went into decision theory with my brilliant supervisors, Per Anders Granhagen and Carl Ask, that I will find some kind of, at least a generic model for good thinking in general. But I didn't find it. And I was surprised as a police officer for kind of having the 6 years to dive into decision theory. I found a lot of good ideas, especially from Montgomery and Svensson, from Swedish researchers, but it was pretty basic, almost, if I came back to the police for that, they were probably just, what? It was too general. So where I found kind of what became the inspiration to a model that I suggested was actually descriptive research from Martin Innes and others who have seen how experienced detectives actually worked on a good day, and trying to conceptualize how is your best day actually, what does that look like, and try to repeat that and do it more often. I think also that's something that we have to kind of communicate to to practitioners that this is not all new. It's not that we are going to change everything you do. There probably are, or at least research shows that there are something that you are doing that is correct. We are just trying to help you to understand why.
I think that's a really good point, and I also think it's really good to have this kind of positive research. I mean, we can learn a lot, of course, from these miscarriages of justice. For instance, in Sweden, we have had several cases, or they have had several cases, as you know, of miscarriages of justice. For example, this Kailinna case, in which one of the really big problems were that the police were, well, I think that's true for very many of the miscarriages of justice, is that there's a strong confirmation bias, and the police are looking just in one direction and not taking evidence into consideration that points in another direction. But within the Kailinna case, who was a man who was innocently convicted for 13 years, and then he was released. When it was found, he was indeed not guilty for the murder. But he, in his case, there was one detective within the group of investigators who actually from the onset was trying to argue that they should also look in other directions, and he was basically, you know, frozen out of the group. So he had to go on sick leave. It was really like socially a very difficult situation. And I think this is another thing. I've worked a lot with the police, both teaching, but also working with them as an expert in cases or consulting. And I'm supervising now two police officers who are doing their PhDs. So I sometimes feel like I'm partly police officer myself almost. But I think one of the big issues there is also organizational. The police in many countries, is my impression, and certainly in Finland and Sweden, have a very old-fashioned kind of organization where it's very, very top-down. It's also very kind of based on the police chief in the individual departments has a lot of power, and they can decide basically anything they want about how the work is organized. And there is very little requirements of, sort of having this kind of, as we were saying earlier about like assessing different hypotheses and looking into the different directions, but also maybe this kind of open culture of people being able to, voice their thoughts in a free way. Of course, there are some departments where it works really well, but it's really dependent on who happens to be there as a chief. And it really, I think it should be better structured. We should have a very, shouldn't be as authoritarian as that. Then there was something you said earlier that I wanted to come back to, just because you were noting that it's important also, for instance, for police officers to hear something from judges. And I think this is another thing I've experienced here, is that in Finland, in southern Finland, which is more inhabited as Norway and Sweden, there are more people down south. The trainings for lawyers, for police officers, for prosecutors, for judges tend to be on their own. So they are within their own professional group. Whereas in the north, when I've been training there, the distances are very long. There are very few professionals comparatively who work with this issue. So they tend much more often to have their training days all together. So I've been invited several times to Lapland, for instance, to go, or to northern Finland to have a full day, and they call all the criminal justice actors there. And I do think it's very beneficial for everyone. It can lead to kind of tight discussions, but that's good. Because in the south, sometimes, not at all always, but sometimes you do hear these tiring conversations where, for instance, defense attorneys are complaining about the police, or the police are complaining about the defense attorneys or the prosecutors. And it's perhaps not that fruitful. It would be quite, I think there's much more interest in really gathering the different perspectives and looking at everyone's, position, and how we could all agree, though, that, doing the process in a way that is legally reliable is certainly for everyone, should be for everyone a goal. And sort of like, where do we meet on this, and what would improve the collaboration. Yeah. Then, of course, given that we have different positions, the defense attorney should play a certain role, and I think everyone understands that role. But to avoid unnecessary issues, and also just to learn, from the different perspectives, I think it's been really a very, very good thing. So I think they lose out on that here in the south.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that's probably part of what also people like you can do, is to kind of be a mediator between these kind of groups and delivering the same message to different groups, because more doors are open to you because you're a leading academic, and so that's a very interesting point. And
Yeah.
if these groups don't communicate as much as they probably could, at least there is someone communicating to all of the groups.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are groups, which is maybe now a little bit outside the criminal justice system, but it's another topic that I've been working with during the recent years quite a lot. We have this research group called Psych Aid at Åbo Academy, working with asylum procedures and how these can be improved. And one thing we've heard quite a bit is that the lawyers working with asylum seekers and then again the asylum officials, they may sometimes be quite annoyed with each other. I think both groups agree that some of the professionals are really good, but some of them are really poor. And I think also here, it really, really would be in the best interest of everyone, and especially, of course, the kind of the legal rights of the asylum seeker, that these professionals can collaborate. And in the end, I mean, they really have the same goal. At least on paper, they all have the goal of getting as full accounts as possible in as a good way as possible to be able to make a correct assessment. So I think also there it's a pity that there's so little training, co-training of these groups and discussions. And of course, then also the interpreters. And this is, of course, the same as in the criminal justice system, that we really would need to train interpreters and investigative interviews. This is something I've had the joy of doing the last years here in Finland for court interpreters who have specialized in child forensic interview interpretation. And it's been amazing. I've learned so much from these interpreters. You know, it's like many of them they are, they're trained interpreters. They have done the court interpretation training, so they are really skilled already. But many of them, we had them this kind of a few months training where they had both, seminar days in child development, memory, suggestibility, disclosure, why do or do not children typically disclose, and also the NICHD interview protocol, which we use here as in many other European countries or countries worldwide. Many of these interpreters had already worked with child interviews, and they were saying that they probably did it all wrong, because even though they were told to phrase the questions exactly as the interviewer does, given that they didn't understand the phenomenon of suggestibility or why you actually need to phrase open-ended questions, they weren't necessarily able to do that. They were trying to help the child talk. And we know from a lot of research that if we want to help children talk but don't have the right instruments, then we are very, very inclined to start suggesting the child. Actually, I have to quote my friend and colleague Sara Landström, professor in Gothenburg, and one of the, our best child interview researchers. She was asked recently, when she was awarded a big prize for her work, what kind of the main problem is, why do child interviews sometimes go wrong? And she was saying that she actually thinks it's this incredible want to help children tell. And I really agree. It's very often that in the case of children that we just want to help them. But if you do not possess the right instruments, the right interview technique, if you do not understand that these helpful questions can be detrimental if they are not open, and then if they're not helping the child to give their own experiences, then you really might lead to disastrous consequences. So these interpreters were kind of saying the same thing, that they try to help the child communicate. And of course, if the child is struggling, if the interviewer is saying, can you tell me all about that? And the child is not answering, then, they might easily say, so was it a bad thing? Or, did he touch you or something else? That is, of course, very, very problematic. But so that was interesting, but also the fact that we learned a lot about one of the issues, of course, with children, but certainly also with adults, if we talk about sexual crimes, is the way we discuss sexuality, body parts. I think, the Nordics, we tend to be quite, nudity is not very odd. It's very traditional. It's been something very natural in Finland, certainly with the sauna culture. It's like, it's not really an issue. And we also have child-friendly words for genitals. So children are taught to use words for genitals at a very early age, which don't have this, weight of being kind of shameful or, like frowned upon. But most other languages do not. So even in English, you don't have words for genitals or child-friendly, certainly not for girls. And I know another of our great scholars, Michael Lamb, who's been working both in the US and in other parts of the world, and of course in the UK as well. He sometimes said, or once said that, in the US, they are only talking about private parts. And I don't know how we can help children tell about, sex abuse experiences if we're not giving them the vocabulary. So how do we help them protect themselves? And this is so true. So this is one of the things that in the interpreter training was quite much discussed. And also, these words for intercourse or having sex, which in many, many languages it's like talked around. You are sleeping with someone or marrying someone, or you are just being together, or he was taking me as a wife, or, there's all kind of course, birds and bees and whatnot. And in many of these languages or dialects, these euphemisms can have very specific meanings, but you would need the interpreter to stop there and say, the interpreter notes that in this particular dialect, we use the word, sleeping together for intercourse or whatever it is. And this is something that we really need to have, trainings together on for interviewers also to be much more aware.
It is really interesting how important language is. I sometimes think also when it comes to more specific around the advice we give, we are habits of our own language because language and culture are so deeply interwoven.
Yes.
So I remember at least for years I've been saying you have to start the interview with an open-ended question. But obviously that doesn't work very well in a communicative setting. You have to break the ice before you can start with an open-ended question. So that's probably what we have to be. I think at least for myself, Julia, I have to be more clear that you always have to break the ice before you start and unwrap that open-ended question. So we often do it kind of hidden, like now. We had a rapport building phase before we started this interview, and how was your weekend? And, it's a closed question. But that kind of subtle invite, it isn't necessarily closed in a way stopping you from saying anything, but it's inviting you to say as much as you find appropriate right now.
And it would have been very strange if you had said, tell me everything about your weekend.
Wouldn't it? It would be completely, I would be invading your space in a very rude way. So these kind of things, I think it's so interesting with language, as you say, and how we probably have to be even more focusing on that in the future. The advice from psychology would look in a cultural language context.
Luckily, there's a lot of interesting research going on pertaining to this currently. So Annelies Vredeveld, for instance, is a professor from the Netherlands, is leading very interesting research on this. And I think one of the things she was saying, she was giving a keynote on the kind of culture within investigative or legal psychology and also investigative interviews. And she was saying that, of course, we cannot expect, for example, all individual police officers to have a deep understanding of all the cultures they may encounter in their work, but to have this kind of cultural humility. And as you said, realize how shaped we are by our own culture, and even have like a minimum of understanding how this may, be expressed in different cultures. It's already like, I think, the beginning of this kind of Socratesian insight into how much you do not know. And I was thinking, I know you were working quite a bit in Southeast Asia, and our interpreters from Southeast Asia were noting that, at least in some of their contexts, it is much more difficult than, for instance, it would be in Northern Europe or probably many of the more Western countries, to say that you don't know or that you didn't understand the question. So it would be kind of rude. And this is, of course, a big thing. Nobody wants to be rude in an interview context. So again, it's something that has to be explicitly, I think, discussed before an interview. Like, what do you do if you do not understand? Well, this is what we now decide that we do, or, how important it is actually to be clear with that. Then another thing I came to think of still about the cultural issue, when I was a very young psychology student, actually, and was confronted with the first case that I had contact with of an investigation of child sexual abuse. I quickly learned that there's this protocol called the NICHD, and it follows these recommendations that seem to be very valid. And some years later, we were as in many other countries, also neighboring Sweden and Norway, we were like doing a lot of efforts in, changing the way children are interviewed in criminal investigations. And one of the things we were sort of giggling about sometimes with my colleagues was the fact that the NICHD seems to kind of depart from this expectation that if you ask a small child, tell me about yourself, that they would actually start telling you something, because we were saying that, well, in Finland, people are not taught to be all that talkative. It's not at all obvious that they will start talking a lot about themselves. I think actually today the situation may already be a bit different, because I think the culture and how we bring up children and how we involve them and sort of encourage them to speak their mind has been developing in a very nice way. So that's a good thing, of course. But other things that are very culturally dependent are these. We all know that if you want to really have a good investigative interview, as you were already saying, we really need to create rapport. And this is something that is also noted in the revised version of the
Mm-hmm.
NICHD for child interviews. And that is great. But also there, I think, my understanding is that when we look at the more cognitive things in an investigative interview, memory, open-ended questions, the risk for misinformation, etc., those seem to be pretty similar around the globe. I think
Mm,
they are not really culturally dependent. But how we socialize with people is, of course, very culturally dependent,
absolutely.
including the strategies of creating rapport. And there are a few interesting small studies on, for example, these suggestions for how to create rapport with children that do show that there are some differences that we need to be mindful of, and maybe these rapport building uh, issues really we need to look at on. So for instance, there was a German study looking at some of these ways in which it suggested that interviewers create rapport, for example, saying the child's name many times. Ivar, how are you, Ivar? Nice to see you, Ivar. That may be okay in an American setting. In Finland, you would be like, that would be immensely odd. And apparently also in Germany, it's not really it's not really part of the, what you would do to create rapport. So these are just like examples, and I think, of course, we don't need to. There's no interview protocol that you should, I believe, repeat as it is written down. You should always apply it to the context at hand. But I think with this report building examples, you really need to have a concise think of what works in your
Absolutely.
context.
Absolutely. Many of these Asian countries where I work, it's completely inappropriate to use the word I, for instance, you,
Ah, yeah.
myself, because that's seen as kind of, focusing on yourself in these
Mm,
collective
mm,
cultures. That is
mm.
completely improper. So you have to, so it's just implicit. You say just eat rice. You saying, so it's implicit that you are eating rice. So it's so interesting then how to pinpoint then what really happened. There was
Yeah.
eating of rice going on. And so who was involved? You just have to kind of assume. It's so, and then if you're going to translate this to a different context and different language, you would probably lose a lot.
There is really interesting research on how, for example, adults who have grown up in a traditional Chinese context recall their childhood experiences compared to adults who have grown up in an US context, precisely relating to these kind of memories of what they did themselves. Like it's apparently on a group level much more typical for people who have grown up in the US to be at a young age taught to talk about themselves and their thoughts and their experiences. It's a very individualistic culture, as we know.
Absolutely.
And on the contrary, in more collectivistic cultures, it's not, children are not supposed to talk about themselves only from their own perspective, which I sort of can sympathize with. So in their in their memories of childhood, they do not necessarily they remember less of what they themselves did or thought, but they remember more about the group. And I think this is immensely interesting and very important if we do encounter these people from different cultures. And I think, of course, one thing we need to avoid when discussing cultural differences is to try to put certain labels and sort of assume that, well, you are from the Arab region, so you must be this and that or the other, but rather open up to this realization that we're all children of our own cultures, and there's
Yeah.
much more variation than what we are used to think also in the, in the Western kind of, in the tradition that we have of researching human behavior. It's been very, very Western focused, and luckily, I think there's a huge change going on right now, and there's a growing realization of this, and that's great, of course.
Absolutely. There is a shift, and speaking of shifts, I'll now try to shift more specifically, if you allow, Julia, into a Finnish context. That since this season is about try to focus more explicitly on some countries. Could you tell me a little bit about how this is applied in a Finnish context? We spoke a little bit how you have been lecturing and communicating and mentoring different actors, but if we think more of a police context, who normally do most of the interviews in this, how are they applying and implementing this knowledge in the Finnish police from your perspective? With all the reservations you have to do, of course, since you're not in it explicitly, but from where you observe?
I think I have a pretty good understanding of this because we very recently had or we've been looking at this issue very closely now, actually very much related also to the Implementers project. I and my colleague Tom Pakkanen, who's also very invested in these issues, sort of did a kind of summary of all the studies that there are on how the Finnish police do investigative interviews, what they know about investigative interviews, and including what he did was, there's not a lot of research around. There's, quite a bit on child interviews, but if we sort of, and that part is, as in, I think, many other countries, when we talk about interviewing child victims and witnesses, that's pretty well set. We have very clear guidance, we have recommendations, we have a 1-year training that the Pretrial Investigation Act is actually requiring police officers to take. So that's great. Plus, they have these units, these expert units that they can consult. And the most difficult cases are then investigated by forensic psychologists, for instance, with special training again. So that is great. The problem is that it sort of ends there. Nowadays, there's been an increasing pressure to improve the investigation of human trafficking. It's a bit, that's great. At the same time, it's really a bit random, I think, that we choose kind of one specific kind of crime. There's not been any such pressure to do really good investigations. So, for example, femicide, or you don't even talk very much about femicide. It's, of course, like intrafamilial violence or homicides, etc. But actually, we do have a huge problem with this crime type in Finland. And it somehow has not gained an attention where you actually would need to be a specialist to look at those issues. Sexual crimes is the same. In some police departments, they have specialized groups who are doing excellent job. They are video recording all the interviews, but it's completely up to the police departments. And then for the children, one of the issues I've been working with lately quite a bit are youth involved in crime, so young child suspects under the age of 18. And also there, it's incredible that we have all these specialized police officers who know really well how to interview reluctant children who have been, for example, sending pictures online. It's almost like, they really are in a similar positions as child suspects. They've done something they know is wrong. They don't want to talk about it, or maybe they do, but they're not sure. So they really are dependent on how this police investigator is behaving towards them. But we don't use this knowledge for child suspects. They are, as we know, child suspects are often also victims of crime. They often have very vulnerable backgrounds. Some of them are manipulated or coerced by older criminals to do acts of criminality. Many of them would probably be quite happy to talk about what they've done if they were met in a decent way. Some of them are, but again, it's really random. So there's no specific training for these police officers. And actually, I just noticed myself, I hadn't realized it until a few weeks ago. I looked up the Pretrial Investigation Act and noted that it does not say anything about that the specialization required would be only for child victims. It is for all children. So we really need to start emphasizing this now and say, look, this is, stated explicitly in the law. But for adults, as I said, my colleague Tom Pakkanen went through everything that there is. And what is nice is that many young police students have now, during the recent years, written their final paperwork on issues related to investigative interviewing. For instance, on the need to video record interviews rather than just writing down summaries, which is unfortunately where we are in Finland. So the police do not video record investigative interviews other than for children, unless they in their own department have decided that this is actually a good thing. Also, there's a growing pressure to do video recording in the case of trafficking victims, which is great. But it's, again, I find it surprisingly random. So again, there are a few departments in Finland where they've had excellent, leadership and organization and understanding, and there they actually do video record. But my understanding is that in most departments it's not. Another problem is that we've had for many, many decades already, or at least a few, a kind of 2-week course in investigative interviewing for experienced police officers, but it's only a small group every year that takes that course. And it's not part of their basic studies. They have almost nothing on investigative interviewing in their basic studies. And then there's a small select group that does this 2-week course. Unfortunately, it does seem that it could be better rooted in the research than it is. I'm sure there's a lot of decent content, but there was a study a couple years ago where one of these police academy students did a questionnaire for quite a lot of police officers working around Finland on what they know about different interviewing methods, and they knew almost nothing. The only thing that was familiar to them was the NICHD. Luckily, I mean, they hadn't been taught to do the read either, so I guess that's a plus.
Yes, a plus.
That's a plus. It was very impressive how little they knew about any other interviewing methods. And one of my colleagues from the police, who was for a long time the chief detective at the sexual crimes unit at the Helsinki police, she did a training in legal psychology that I'm coordinating, where we of course talked about these investigative interviewing methods. Although this course is mostly for other criminal justice professionals, so it wasn't like a course in interviewing. But certainly we had that as a part of the training. She was saying later that it's actually quite a shock to be working, a trained police officer working within the police with the kind of investigations where the interview is the absolutely most crucial tool that you have, and realize that you have to take a training outside the police to actually learn about these methods that are created by the police and for the police, which is, so we're not really doing that well here.
That is really interesting, and how I have to say, as you, Julia, how, because at least I think people from outside of at least the Nordics think about us, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, as pretty similar when it comes to these kind of things. That because we are very similar in many, many other areas of the society and culture, but in this area they have quite big differences. And I think what you point out here about recording is probably, at least from my country, that was actually the tipping point in Norway. I myself, together with my good friend and colleague Asbjørn Raklev, were heading a national test trial project on recording all the way back in 1998. And, at that time, digital recording equipment was quite clunky and very, very expensive. So the Ministry of Justice invested a lot in trying to test different equipment, and we gave this to high-level departments around the country. And it was Asbjørn's and my job to kind of gather these experiences and see. But we got nothing back. Hey, after a year, there was no interviews.
Yeah.
And we needed kind of to, have a hard talk. What's going on? Doesn't it work? Is there something wrong with the technology? And it was complete silence in the rooms. And then one evening we went out for a beer and a dinner, and then people started to talk. Said, Ivar, I don't feel comfortable with recording myself because no one ever taught me how to do an interview. So that's when it's kind of emerged to us, of course, that reluctance there, that is because we need training. This is not only about justice, it's also about officers' well-being, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you know, and so that was kind of the drop. They said, of
Yeah.
course, if we're
Yeah.
going to implement recording as a Norwegian standard, the first standard is to teach officers basic interviewing skills and memory, human memory and communication and that. So that was, and I think that was also a really good think about it, alleyway down to it, because then they actually needed it. And we
Yeah.
also made it a bit exclusive. We said, you are not going to do this if you're not trained to it,
Yeah.
because we have to take care of you. Of course, that can be debated, because probably the people who hadn't training was probably the people really should be interviewed, who should be recorded. On the other hand, it gave it like an aura of exclusivity that, okay, I am certified for recording.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
became kind of a skill, a thing. I also want that. I want to
Yeah.
be part of that group that are certified to go in and do those interviews that are
Yeah.
profiled and important and be recorded. I think that's so interesting how that can be changed into cultures of positive drive. But a final question, because you are also in Finland doing a lot of interesting research on technology, how technology can help us in implementing or developing these kind of skills or practices.
That would be the topic for a whole new discussion. But if we still think very pragmatically at the police, I think here in Finland also, like, there's quite a lot of police investigators who actually would want to do the video recording, but some of them are not allowed to within their department. I think we're on the way. It's clearly like the position is changing slowly, and we are typically following the example of Sweden, where the situation has also been really bad until a couple of years ago, when they had this new sort of rules of video recording initial interviews, and that these can in some cases be allowed to be presented as evidence in court. And I think in Finland we do have this tradition of looking to Sweden, because we kind of share the same basis. Well, we have the same legal history, so to say. So I think, and one thing that I've understood is working really well in Sweden is one of the questions I always get is, well, how are we gonna preserve all these video recordings? I mean, as if that really would be require a lot of space anyway. And the other thing is, like, how do we do with all the transcripts? Who's going to do the transcription? It's so costly. And also for prosecutors, if they get like 13,000 pages with transcripts, that's really difficult. And it's true. That is really difficult. In Sweden, I've understood that they nowadays use a very, very good automatic. We know that nowadays Whisper and whatever is out there, there's a lot of very good transcription programs. And in Sweden, apparently, they have also one program that actually makes this kind of summary for prosecutors. Of course, we know that these cannot be perhaps trusted 100%, so there may be things that you still need to go back and look at. But certainly, I think their technology will just make it much more easy to, we will get rid of some of the things that have been problematic in the past. So that's one thing. The last years, I've also been looking quite a lot at human trafficking cases, many of which involve victims or parties around the world. For instance, we have these forced labor cases. For instance, in Finland, we've had cases with berry pickers from Thailand. So lots of victims who need to be heard from that are from Thailand. We can, of course, either fly them all here, or then we can ensure that we have really decent ways of hearing people remotely. And that's something I'm doing research on right now, particularly in the context of hearing people remotely to court. And I think there's a lot of good possibilities there. We need to make sure that these processes are led very well by the judges, and that people actually, are heard from. It's very pragmatic things, like they're heard from, safe spaces with legal support, and with, an understanding that they can follow the rest of the procedures if they want to, etc. But there's a lot that is probably going to make these cross-border hearings much easier, and also much more human friendly. And of course, then again, like, one thing that you've done in Norway for decades is to preserve the pre-trial investigation evidence, to the human memory. And if you have a victim who actually has Alzheimer, or dies, or is just unable for other reasons to talk about every aspects of the crime 2 or 3 or 4 years later in court, we have these terribly long court procedures nowadays. Then you can actually still get their voices heard through the video recorded interview. So I think there's a lot there. Then, of course, technology can certainly assist also in concretely in investigations. So we just published a study recently, or it was PhD student Liisa Järvilehto, she's also an investigator. So she's been doing child abuse investigations for more than a decade and is an excellent professional. Like you, this wonderful example of what is it Becky Milne calls it, a capraca. This
Yeah.
person who really knows the context from a practical point of view and is also now really on top of research. So one study that she first authored was about how to use AI to help in coming up with meaningful, relevant alternative hypotheses to child abuse allegations. And actually, that's something that AI was really good at. And that can be a really, simple but really helpful tool. It often can take quite a lot of time to think of all the relevant hypotheses. And of course, then experts are good at disregarding stupid suggestions. So if there are some, tweaks there, then you can disregard it. That's one thing. And she's now looking at to what extent AI can help human interviewers, improve their interview questions with all, of course, with all the limits there are to that. I do think that there's we can probably develop very useful tools for both interview training and also interview assessments, and also perhaps even like real life aids in investigative interviews. So it's really interesting, I think, to look at how far we can sort of safely use. But I think there's a lot, and there's many others are doing research there as well. And of course, I think we really, really need to be mindful that we don't put up something, for use before we can ensure that it does not lead to negative consequences. And I'm not at all sure that I see in any future that AI would take over investigative interviewing, but I do see AI being a potentially very, very helpful assistant to investigative interviews, and at least very much so in training and assessing interviews, etc.
Julia, we could go on, I think, for the rest of the day with another list of really interesting topics.
Absolutely.
I would say thank you for a really, really engaging and inspiring conversation.
Thank you, Ivar. It was nice as always to talk to you.